Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Green Supply Chain Insights. I apologize, we've been away longer than expected, but rest assured that it was all in the interest of guaranteeing stronger insights, which I think we've achieved, but you'll be the judge of that. Now, today I want to react to something that is unfolding in real time, and that is already sending shockwaves across global supply chains, the US-Iran war. Now, this is very much not a political conversation. This is not a political episode. I'm definitely not here to analyze the conflict itself, but I do want to explore what this kind of geopolitical shocks means for industrial decarbonization and for the future of global supply chains. Because major events like these make one thing explicitly clear. The energy transition is not happening in a vacuum. It is deeply exposed to geopolitics, to trade routes, and to resource competition. Now, a quick update before we go further. Since we prepared the episode, an indefinite ceasefire has been announced. It happened just yesterday. And while that lowers the immediate risk of escalation, it does not remove the supply chain shock, the volatility, or the structural exposure this crisis has already revealed. Trade routes remain fragile, shipping confidence is not fully restored, and the market is still pricing risk. So the big question I want to answer today is this crisis a setback or an acceleration for industrial decarbonization? To answer that, we'll break this down across our typical industry sectors: energy, chemicals, and metals, or more broadly today, minerals and critical raw materials. Then we'll zoom out and we'll look at the supply chain implications. So let's start with energy. This is probably where the signals look the most contradictory. In the short term, we are seeing a clear and unfortunate regression. Coal is making a comeback in some markets. Natural gas is once more at the center of the conversation, which is starting to feel like Groundhog Day here in Europe, where we're also seeing flexibility introduced around methane rules to avoid these disruptions and energy price volatility. So the question is, are these governments, European governments, being pragmatic or inconsistent? My take is this is inconsistency, and that's becoming a real problem because policy uncertainty is now as disruptive as the crisis itself. You can't build long-term energy systems on short-term policy swings. Now, to be fair, there is still a system logic behind some of the decisions. Fossil fuels still provide dispatchable power, they stabilize grids, they fill gaps when infrastructure isn't ready. So we still need them, but that logic is shrinking more and more. Because when we look at the big picture, the direction is already set. Renewables capacity has grown massively in the last few years. Solar and battery costs have dropped significantly. And in markets like Spain, we're already seeing how renewables can structurally reduce dependence on gas in electricity pricing. The long-term equation hasn't changed. If anything, this crisis reinforces it. Energy independence matters, and the only scalable path to energy independence is electrification powered by domestic clean energy. So yes, we are seeing some short-term disruption, but in the long term, the case for renewables, storage, and nuclear complement is stronger than ever. Now, let's move to a part of the system that gets far less attention. It's, in my opinion, a hidden weak point, which is the chemical industry. Because this is where things get a bit more complicated. We tend to talk about the energy transition as if it's mainly about electricity, which is far from the full picture. Chemicals are traditionally downstream of oil and gas, but more importantly, they sit upstream of everything: fertilizers, manufacturing inputs, consumer products, batteries, automotive, and more. They are embedded across the entire economy. And this crisis is exposing some real vulnerabilities, or perhaps amplifying rather than exposing them. We've seen sharp disruptions in key inputs like urea and sulfur. I know they're not as visible as oil and gas, but they matter quite a bit. Sulfur plays a role in battery value chains, and urea is one of the most widely used fertilizers that directly affects food systems. And here's the key point: around 20% of global fertilizer exports move through the Persian Gulf waters. So this is not just an energy conflict, it impacts food security, it impacts industrial inputs, and it's impacting or demonstrating the lack of supply chain resilience. This hits Europe harder because our chemical industry is already under pressure. High energy costs, global competition, and dependence on imports. Sorry. The risk here is not just disruption, is that structural weakening. If we lose domestic capacity, local capacity, we don't just lose on competitiveness, we increase our dependency. And that dependency is exactly what this crisis is exposing at the core risk. So now let's go one level deeper and look at minerals and critical raw materials, an area where the green transition has always been less green than we would like it to be. Because these are systems that are still too fragile, they depend on fossil-linked logistics, fossil-derived intermediates, and they have highly concentrated supply chains. Processing capacity sits in very few regions, mainly China when it comes to rare earth minerals, and critical raw materials then depend on complex global flows. Many of these flows pass through geopolitical choke points, not necessarily the one at the center of today's conflict, but this serves as a very clear example of what could happen if these material flows were disrupted elsewhere. This doesn't necessarily signal a failure in the energy transition itself, but it does expose a risk on how it's been built. The answer, to me, is not to slow down on decarbonization, but rather to make it more resilient. That means exploring more diversified processing, strategic stockpiles locally, increasing recycling capacity, and expanding on ally shoring and, where possible, multi-shore supply chain. Now, let's wrap this today with a supply chain reality check, because this is, I think, where the lesson and the answer to that question becomes more concrete. We are still far too exposed. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil consumption and around 1/5 of global LNG trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz. And for some refined products, the exposure is even sharper. For example, a significant share of global jet fuel supply depends on that same route. That single choke point connects directly to fuel prices, jet fuel availability, energy costs, and electricity pricing. We've already seen all of these prices spike significantly as a result of that disruption. And possibly the market still hasn't fully absorbed that shock. So even with this indefinite ceasefire in place, volatility is likely to persist because trade routes, shipping confidence, and geopolitical stability are not fully restored. Even if escalation pauses, pricing stability will not disappear overnight. And that leads to a lesson that I feel like we should have learned by now, and it's that you cannot build resilience during a crisis. When the shock hits, it's already too late. You don't have time to redesign supply chains. You don't have time to build alternatives. And what often happens is that we make the wrong decisions because they are, at that point, the only viable ones. This is why regulatory consistency matters so much. That long-term stability is what allows the structural changes to happen. And the structural change is what builds real resilience. Without it, we stay reactive. And these reactive systems are fragile systems. So let's go back to the original question. Is this crisis a setback for decarbonization or an acceleration? Well, we've seen that it basically depends on the lens we look at it through, right? It can be both. So there's not a clear answer, at least not in a simple way. But what it does do is that it very clearly exposes that decarbonization, as it stands today, is not resilient enough. And that is the biggest risk we need to act on, because resilience and decarbonization are both long-term plays. They require consistency, they require investment, and they require staying the course, not reacting every time the system is under pressure. We know where we're heading, we know what needs to be built, and the problem we are repeatedly having is execution under stress. That's it for today's episode. If you found this useful, share it with your network. And as always, you can find Green Supply Chain Insights on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.